They laughed at the saloon girl begging for water, until the lonely cowboy came with a cradle and named her. The town was small and dusty, a place where the wind blew endlessly through empty streets, and the sun seemed to hang low in the sky as if it were tired of shining. Most of the buildings were made of weathered wood, with paint peeling off in long strips and signs swinging lazily above saloon doors. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, but kindness often hid behind suspicion and laughter. In this town, a young girl stood alone outside the saloon, her hands cupped, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked for water. She had no name that anyone cared to remember, at least not in public. To the townspeople, she was just another saloon girl, one of many who had wandered into this rough place looking for work or perhaps trying to survive a world that seemed determined to forget her. Her dress was old, patched in places where the fabric had worn thin, and her shoes were scuffed and dusty, the soles almost completely worn through. Her hair, once likely soft and neat, now hung in tangled strands around her face. But it was her eyes that drew the most attention, not in a way that people respected, but in a way that made them smirk and whisper. They were tired, yes, but there was also a quiet fire in them, a spark of something that refused to be completely crushed by the world's cruelty. That morning, as the sun rose over the hills and cast a golden haze across the town, she stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, her throat dry and parched. She approached the saloon, a place that smelled of whiskey, smoke, and the faint sweetness of stale bread. Inside, laughter erupted, loud and careless, mixing with the clink of glasses and the shuffle of cards on the table. A man in a wide-brimmed hat threw back his head and laughed at some joke he had just made, spilling a little whiskey onto the floor, which no one seemed to notice. The saloon was alive with noise, with energy, but it was the kind of energy that left no room for kindness or sympathy. She raised her hand slightly, trying to catch someone's attention. "Please, just a little water," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. Her words barely carried over the raucous sounds of the room, and when a few people noticed her at all, they laughed. The laughter was not cruel in a dramatic sense, but it carried a weight that made her feel smaller, as though her very presence was a joke. "Go on, girl," someone shouted. "You don't belong here." She held her cup closer to her chest, her knuckles white around the worn edges. She had learned long ago that begging politely often worked better than demanding, that humility sometimes earned more than anger in a world that had little patience for either. Her stomach growled faintly, a reminder that it had been too long since her last meal, and her throat burned with thirst. Each moment she stood there, the heat of the sun pressed down on her, and the dust swirled around her ankles, sticking to her damp skin. Inside the saloon, a group of men continued to gamble and shout. They barely noticed her, except when one of them threw a coin in her direction as if she were a stray dog. She caught it reflexively, but it was not enough to quench the thirst that clawed at her chest. She looked down at the coin and then back at the men. Their laughter continued, careless and ignorant, and for a moment she felt the old familiar ache of being invisible, of being judged only by the shape of her body, the dirt on her dress, the tired lines on her face. She had come here not expecting sympathy, yet the lack of even basic human acknowledgement stung more than any harsh word could. Her mind drifted to the life that had brought her here, to the roads she had walked and the doors that had been closed in her face. She remembered the small farm where she had grown up, a place that had once smelled of fresh earth and blooming flowers, where laughter was frequent and kind. But life had a way of changing quickly, of pulling the rug out from under the ones who least expected it. Her parents had passed away when she was young, leaving her with nothing but memories and a sense of loneliness that had grown heavier with each passing year. She had wandered from town to town, taking what work she could find, sleeping wherever she could, learning early that the world often judged people before it understood them. Yet, despite everything, she held her head high. There was a quiet dignity in the way she stood, a refusal to let despair twist her spirit completely. Even as the townspeople laughed, she did not crumble or run. She waited, because somewhere deep inside, she believed that someone might see her differently. Not as a joke, not as a thing to be mocked, but as a person who deserved kindness, who deserved the simplest of human compassion. The morning passed slowly. A few passers-by threw half-hearted glances her way, some shaking their heads as if she were an inconvenience. A child on the street tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "Why is she standing there?" The mother shrugged and they moved on. The girl's lips were dry and her tongue felt thick, but she did not give up. Her hands trembled slightly, but she gripped the cup tightly, as if holding on to hope itself. Then, a man at the edge of the street, leaning against a wooden post, noticed her. He was not laughing, nor did he comment. He simply watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable, shaded by the wide brim of his hat. There was something in the way he stood, calm and steady, that seemed to contrast with the noise and chaos around him. For a fleeting moment, The girl wondered if he was like the others, just another person who would ignore her and move on. Yet, something in his eyes told her that he saw her, not just the saloon girl or the beggar. Her heart beat a little faster, cautious and hesitant. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became almost unbearable. Sweat dripped down her forehead, soaking her hair, but she did not move. Her resolve was firm, even though every muscle in her body ached. She had learned that survival required patience, that sometimes the world would not give you what you needed until you showed that you would not break under pressure. Still, the loneliness weighed on her, an invisible cloak she could not shrug off. By late morning, the laughter in the saloon had not lessened. Glasses clinked, coins rattled, and voices raised in jest, mocking each other and sometimes the occasional customer. She stood her ground, hoping for a drop of water, a small act of human decency that might remind her she was not completely forgotten. And then, as if the universe had chosen that moment carefully, a shadow fell across her. She looked up and saw the man at the post beginning to walk toward her, his boots crunching softly on the dusty road. He carried nothing in his hands, but his presence was calm, deliberate, a quiet kind of strength that seemed to say he would not be swayed by the town's mockery or cruelty. The girl's heart fluttered in a mix of fear and hope. She had not expected anyone to approach her. Not really. Most people would have walked past, laughed, or tossed another coin her way. But this man stopped a few feet from her and simply nodded, as if acknowledging her struggle without judgment. He said nothing at first, just stood there, letting her see that she was not entirely invisible. For the first time that day, the weight of the world felt a little lighter, because someone had chosen to notice her for more than her circumstances. And so she waited there, still clutching the cup, watching as the man's gaze met hers. She did not speak, unsure of what words could express the mix of relief, gratitude, and cautious hope she felt. The town continued its noise around her, the laughter and clinking glasses still ringing in her ears, but for the first time, it seemed less important. For the first time, she sensed that maybe, just maybe, someone might see beyond the saloon girl and the beggar and see her as she truly was, a person with a story, with hope, with the quiet strength to endure another day. The day was growing hotter, and the town streets were almost empty as the sun climbed higher, casting long, harsh shadows along the wooden sidewalks. The laughter and clinking glasses from the saloon still drifted out, mixing with the dust stirred up by the occasional wagon or horse passing through. The girl continued to stand outside, her cup held tightly in her hands, but now her eyes were no longer just tired. They were alert, scanning the street for any sign of the man who had approached her earlier. The brief nod, the calm presence, had left a mark she could not ignore. She did not know his name, nor had he spoken more than a few words, yet somehow he had given her the smallest, most precious gift she could imagine: acknowledgement. Hours passed, and the girl's hope did not fade, though her body felt heavy with thirst and hunger. She had learned through experience that the world often tested patience in ways that were harsh and unforgiving, but she also knew that waiting could sometimes bring unexpected moments that changed everything. And in that quiet tension, she sensed something different that afternoon. A subtle shift in the air that made the dusty street feel alive with possibility. Suddenly, from the far end of the street, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the stillness. At first it was distant, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, more deliberate. The girl instinctively took a step back, shielding her eyes against the glaring sun. A lone figure was approaching, riding a horse with a steady, rhythmic gait. There was something different about him immediately. He did not rush, he did not yell, he did not sway with the nervous energy of a traveler trying to get somewhere. He moved with a calm purpose, as if he belonged both to this land and to its quiet moments of reflection. As he came closer, the girl could make out the details. The cowboy wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, a faded coat that had seen years of travel, and sturdy boots that had clearly walked through every type of terrain imaginable. There was a stillness about him, a quiet strength that seemed almost out of place in a town where chaos and mockery often ruled. He dismounted slowly, his horse stepping with careful precision, and tied it to a post nearby. The girl felt her heart beat faster, a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation filling her chest. He approached her with slow, measured steps. There was no judgment in his eyes, no trace of the laughter she had grown accustomed to from the townspeople. Instead, there was a warmth, a softness that made her cup of water feel like more than just a simple drink. It felt like someone had seen her struggle, someone had recognized her worth in a way the world had long forgotten. She did not speak, unsure of what words could capture the swirl of emotions inside her. She simply held out her cup, her small gesture speaking louder than anything she could say. "Here," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a calm authority. He reached into a satchel at his side and drew out a small canteen, uncapping it and offering it to her. She hesitated for only a moment before taking a careful sip, the cool water sliding down her throat and easing the burning in her chest. Relief washed over her, but it was accompanied by something more, a feeling of safety, however temporary, in the presence of this quiet stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She did not look up at him immediately, fearing that if she met his eyes, her emotions might overwhelm her. But when she finally did, she saw something in his expression that surprised her. A recognition, not of her beauty or youth, but of her resilience, her quiet strength in the face of hardship. The cowboy nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "You shouldn't have to stand out here like this," he said gently. "No one should have to beg for water." His words were simple, but they carried weight, as if he had spent his life watching injustice quietly unfold and had finally found a moment where he could act. The girl's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her this way before. Most people either ignored her or mocked her existence, but this man, he seemed different. For the next few days, he returned. Each time he would bring a small kindness, fresh water, a piece of bread, or sometimes just a reassuring word. He did not force her to speak of her past, nor did he ask her to explain herself. Instead, he simply acknowledged her presence and treated her as though she mattered. The girl, who had grown accustomed to shadows and whispers, began to notice a change within herself. She felt less invisible, as if someone had pulled back a curtain and allowed her to step into the light, even if only for a few minutes at a time. The townspeople continued to whisper about the cowboy and the saloon girl. Some were curious, some disapproving, and some simply amused by what they called an unlikely friendship. But the girl paid them little attention. She had learned long ago that people's opinions could not define her unless she allowed them to. Instead, she focused on the moments of connection that the cowboy offered, small gestures that carried immense meaning. She noticed the gentleness in his hands when he handed her water, the patience in his voice when he spoke, and the quiet understanding in his eyes that seemed to see past the surface and into the core of who she was. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon and the town streets glowed with warm golden light, the cowboy brought something unexpected. He carried a small wooden box, simple in design but clearly crafted with care. He set it down in front of her and opened it, revealing a few essentials: a clean scarf, a small loaf of bread, and a tiny folded blanket. "You deserve more than this town gives," he said quietly. "Take it, keep it, and know that someone sees you." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked rapidly to hold them back. Words failed her, but gratitude shone in her gaze. Days turned into a week, and the pattern continued. The cowboy's visits became the highlight of her otherwise monotonous and weary existence. She began to look forward to them, not because she relied on him for survival, but because his presence reminded her of the world beyond ridicule and mockery. She started to imagine possibilities she had long given up on, possibilities of kindness, of respect, of a life that was not defined by hardship alone. During one particularly quiet afternoon, the cowboy finally spoke more about himself. He shared small details. He had grown up on a ranch far beyond the mountains, had traveled many towns searching for work, and had learned that life was often cruel, but that kindness could be found if one chose to see it. He did not reveal the depths of his past, nor did he need to. The girl listened intently, feeling a sense of camaraderie and understanding that she had rarely experienced in her life. His words were simple, yet they carried wisdom born from experience and the quiet observation of life's hardships. Through these moments, something began to shift inside the girl. She found herself standing a little taller, holding her head a little higher. She smiled more often, though cautiously, and started to imagine a future where she was not just a saloon girl, begging for water, but a person with dignity and worth. The townspeople continued their laughter and whispers, but she no longer felt crushed under their gaze. Instead, she had learned that one person's acknowledgement could outweigh 1,000 acts of mockery. By the end of that week, a subtle change had settled over the dusty street where she had first stood. The girl no longer waited timidly at the edge of the saloon. She moved with purpose, carrying herself with a newfound quiet strength. The cowboy continued to visit, never imposing, never demanding, but always offering support in small, meaningful ways. The townspeople watched this transformation with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, yet none could deny the visible change in her demeanor. For the girl, the arrival of the cowboy had marked the beginning of something she had long forgotten: hope. The kind of hope that does not shout, but whispers, and grows quietly inside, waiting for someone to recognize it. She had been laughed at, ignored, and ridiculed, but now she felt seen, and in that simple recognition, she began to believe that life could hold more than survival. It could hold kindness, respect, and perhaps even a chance at happiness. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she stood on the same street where she had begged for water days before. The cup was still in her hand, but now it felt lighter, almost symbolic of the weight that had been lifted from her shoulders. She glanced down the road, and there was the cowboy, leaning against his horse, watching silently. She smiled softly, a smile that spoke of gratitude, trust, and a small, growing hope that maybe, just maybe, her life could change. And for the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. The days that followed were warmer, the sun stretching across the sky like a golden blanket that seemed to touch every corner of the town. The girl had grown used to seeing the cowboy each morning, his calm presence bringing comfort like a steady rhythm in the chaos of her life. She had learned to expect nothing but his quiet kindness, and yet each gesture, each word, carried more weight than she had ever experienced from anyone else. The townspeople still whispered behind their hands, some skeptical, some mocking, but the girl barely noticed them now. Her world had grown a little larger, a little brighter, because of this man who saw her not as a saloon girl or a beggar, but as a person worth noticing. One afternoon, the cowboy approached with something unusual. He walked down the dusty street with a small wooden cradle balanced carefully in his arms. The girl stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening in surprise. The townspeople had never seen him carry such a thing. It was simple, handmade, but sturdy, and its smooth wood reflected the late afternoon sunlight. There was a quiet dignity in the way he held it, a respect that seemed almost reverent. The girl felt a strange stirring in her chest, a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Is that for me?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with disbelief. She had learned not to expect much, and yet here was something so unexpected, so generous, that she struggled to find words. The cowboy shook his head slightly, his expression calm but kind. "Not exactly for you," he said, lowering the cradle gently to the ground. "It's for what comes next, for something new." He didn't explain fully, and she didn't press him. She had learned that some gestures were meant to be felt, not questioned, and this one felt heavy with meaning. The cradle sat between them, small but solid, a symbol of care and protection. The girl knelt beside it, running her fingers over the smooth wood. For the first time in her life, she felt a strange but comforting sensation that someone believed in her future, that someone imagined her as capable of hope and responsibility, not just survival. She looked up at the cowboy, and for the first time she saw the depth of his quiet strength, not in the way he carried himself, or in his skills as a rider, but in his patience, his thoughtfulness, and the way he gave without expecting anything in return. Over the next few days, the girl and the cowboy spent time together with the cradle. He taught her how to clean it, how to polish the wood, and how to prepare it as if it were a precious thing, because it was. Every movement he made, every instruction he gave, carried a kind of gentle respect that the girl had rarely experienced. It was not just about the cradle, it was about showing her that she mattered, that she was capable of care, of responsibility, of love. The townspeople began to notice this change, and as always, they had their opinions. Some whispered that the cowboy was foolish, that a saloon girl did not deserve such attention. Others were curious, peering from behind curtains and doorways to watch the interactions between the two. But the girl barely noticed the whispers anymore. She had begun to understand that life's true value was not measured by public opinion, but by moments like these, moments of quiet care, moments of being seen. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the cowboy and the girl sat on the wooden sidewalk beside the cradle. He had brought water and bread, as he often did, and they shared the small meal in companionable silence. The girl finally dared to ask a question that had been lingering in her mind. Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The cowboy looked at her, his eyes calm and steady, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice that was gentle but firm, he said, "Because someone has to. Because it matters that you see yourself as worthy, even if the rest of the town does not. Everyone deserves someone who believes in them." His words sank deep into her heart, stirring feelings she had long suppressed, hope, trust, and the faintest glimpse of joy. The girl looked down at the cradle again, imagining what it represented. She realized that it was not just an object, but a symbol, a promise that life could be different, that she could nurture, protect, and care for something precious. And if she could do that, maybe she could also nurture herself, rebuild her life, and find a sense of purpose beyond the struggles she had faced. As the days went on, the cradle became a central part of her routine. She polished it carefully each morning, arranged the small blankets and cloths with care, and even began to speak softly to it, imagining a life that was full of love and protection. It was strange, she thought, how an object could bring such profound change. But the cowboy never dismissed her feelings. He encouraged them, nurturing her growth in ways that words alone could not describe. One afternoon, as they worked together outside the saloon, the girl noticed a group of children watching from a distance. They were curious, perhaps a little wary, but their eyes followed her every move. She realized then that her world was expanding, that her influence, however small, was beginning to touch others. The cradle, once just a simple wooden object, had become a bridge between her and the world. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, respected, and capable of creating care in a world that had often shown her none. The cowboy, always patient, noticed her thoughts. "You see," he said quietly, "care can grow. Small things matter. One act of kindness can change many lives, even if you don't see it immediately." The girl nodded, feeling a sense of understanding she had never known before. She realized that she was learning not just to survive, but to live, to care for something, to feel joy in small victories, and to believe in herself. That evening, as the town settled into the quiet lull of night, she stood beside the cradle, gazing at it with newfound respect. The world outside still held its hardships, its mockery, and its harshness, but inside her heart, something had shifted. She felt a sense of purpose and belonging, anchored by the cowboy's unwavering belief in her. She understood that the cradle was more than a gift. It was an invitation to a new life, a life in which she could be more than the labels others had placed on her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the future, not as a continuation of hardship, but as a series of choices and possibilities. She could nurture, protect, and grow. She could learn to trust, to hope, and to find strength within herself. The cradle was a beginning, and with it, a path forward. In the days that followed, the girl's confidence grew. She began to move through the town with a quiet dignity, her head held higher, her steps more certain. The townspeople, noticing the change, whispered among themselves. Some continued to mock, but others were intrigued by her transformation, and though the girl did not seek approval, she could feel the subtle shift in the way people regarded her. She was no longer merely a saloon girl. She was someone who carried hope, someone who had begun to reclaim her life. Through it all, the cowboy remained a steady presence. He never demanded gratitude, never sought recognition, but he continued to offer guidance and support, teaching her lessons in patience, care, and self-respect. Together, they maintained the cradle, preparing it for a future that seemed full of possibilities. And through these small, deliberate acts, the girl began to heal, not entirely, not instantly, but enough to feel the warmth of hope and the quiet power of being seen and valued. By the end of Part 3, the girl understood that life was capable of transformation. The cradle was a symbol, yes, but it was also a mirror, reflecting the potential within her. She had learned that change could begin with simple acts of kindness, and that even in a town filled with mockery and doubt, someone could choose to see the good in another person. The cowboy had given her more than a cradle. He had given her a foundation on which to rebuild her sense of self, to embrace hope, and to step into a life that she had once thought impossible. And as the sun set each day, casting a warm glow over the dusty town, the girl stood beside the cradle with a heart full of cautious optimism. She no longer begged for water, no longer hid from the world. She had begun to discover what it meant to be seen, to be cared for, and to believe that life could hold more than survival. It could hold love, respect, and the promise of new beginnings. This morning sun rose slowly over the small, dusty town, casting long shadows along the wooden sidewalks and reflecting golden light from the weathered saloon doors. The girl stood beside the cradle, brushing a hand across its smooth surface. The days since the cowboy had brought it had changed her in ways she had not fully understood. She had begun to feel stronger, more certain of herself, and slowly, quietly, a sense of hope had begun to grow in her heart. She had learned that life, even in a harsh and judgmental world, could offer moments of care, kindness, and recognition, and these moments were more powerful than any mockery she had ever endured. The cowboy approached, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he walked. He carried a small bundle of cloth and some carefully wrapped items, but it was not the objects themselves that caught the girl's attention. It was the steady calm in his steps, the gentle smile on his face, and the quiet understanding in his eyes. There was something in the way he moved, the way he looked at her, that made her feel both safe and respected. "Today," he said softly, setting down the bundle, "we take the next step." His voice was gentle, but there was a weight to it, a sense that what he was about to do mattered deeply. The girl tilted her head, her heart beating faster with anticipation and nervousness. She did not know what he meant exactly, but she sensed that it was significant. She had come to trust him, to rely on his quiet guidance, and now She felt a mixture of excitement and fear at what was to come. The cowboy knelt beside the cradle and carefully arranged the contents of the bundle: a small, clean blanket, some soft cloths, and a simple ribbon. "This is for you," he said, placing the blanket gently in the cradle. "Not because you need it, but because you deserve it, and because it is time for you to have a name that belongs to you alone." The girl's eyes widened in surprise. "A name?" "I would be so happy." She had never been given one that felt truly hers. People had always referred to her as the saloon girl or the beggar, labels that defined her by her hardships rather than her character. The cowboy looked at her steadily, waiting for her to speak, but she found no words. Her throat was tight, and her mind raced with the weight of what he had said. To have a name, a real name, given by someone who saw her for who she was, this was more than she had ever imagined. The townspeople had laughed at her, mocked her, and ignored her. But this man, this quiet, steady presence in her life, was offering something profound: identity, dignity. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of parchment. On it he had written a single name, chosen carefully, thoughtfully, with meaning and intention. "This name," he said, "is not just a word. It is who you are, who you can be, and what you deserve to carry with you into the world. Will you accept it?" The girl felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so long hiding, so long existing without recognition, that the weight of this simple act overwhelmed her. With trembling hands, she reached for the parchment and unfolded it. Her eyes fell on the word, written in careful, deliberate letters. She whispered it softly, tasting the sound on her tongue, feeling it wrap around her soul like a warm embrace. It was hers alone, and in that moment she felt a profound shift within herself. The labels of the past, the mockery, the loneliness, seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of self-worth she had never known. The cowboy watched her closely, his expression calm and patient. "This name is not just for today," he said gently. "It is for every day that comes after. Let it remind you of your strength, your courage, and your right to be seen and respected." The girl nodded, tears welling in her eyes, and for the first time in her life, she felt fully seen, not for her hardships, not for her past, but for the person she was and the person she could become. From that moment, life began to change. The girl carried herself differently, moving through the town with a quiet dignity that had not been there before. She no longer hid at the edges of the saloon, no longer waited timidly for scraps of attention or water. She walked with purpose, her steps measured and confident, her head held high. The townspeople noticed the change, and though some whispered and some remained skeptical, none could deny that something remarkable had happened. She had transformed, not through defiance or confrontation, but through recognition, care, and the quiet power of being given a name and a chance to grow. The cradle remained a central part of her daily routine. She polished it carefully, arranged the blankets, and tended to it with reverence. But more than that, it became a symbol of her transformation, a reminder that life could hold more than suffering and ridicule. It represented possibility, a future she could shape with her own hands, guided by the lessons she had learned from the cowboy, lessons of patience, care, and the importance of seeing oneself as worthy. In the days that followed, the girl began to take small steps toward reclaiming her life. She spoke to others in the town with more confidence, no longer shrinking from their gazes. She helped where she could, offering small acts of kindness in return for the care she had received. And though the townspeople had once ignored or laughed at her, many began to see her differently. Respect does not always arrive quickly, but it often follows quiet strength, and the girl had found a power within herself that could not be ignored. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and cast a warm glow over the streets, the cowboy and the girl sat together by the cradle. The town was quiet, the sounds of life muted in the fading light. He looked at her and said, "You have grown stronger than you know. Remember, your name is not just letters on paper. It is a reminder of who you are and what you deserve." The girl smiled softly, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. She understood now that her name, her identity, and her self-worth were intertwined, and that they could guide her through the challenges that still lay ahead. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it without struggle. She still faced mockery from some corners of the town, and there were moments when doubt crept back in. But the girl had discovered something far more powerful than fear or ridicule, the knowledge that she was seen, valued, and capable of creating a life of dignity and respect. The cradle, the cowboy's quiet guidance, and the gift of her name had set her on a path of self-discovery and empowerment that could not easily be shaken. As the days turned into weeks, the girl began to dream again. She imagined a life where she could contribute, where she could care for others and where she could embrace her own strength. She began to speak more openly, to laugh more freely, and to stand proudly in the face of the town's whispers. The name she had been given was no longer just a word. It was a part of her, a reminder that she had been recognized and honored, and that she had the power to shape her own destiny. Through this process, the girl and the cowboy developed a bond built on mutual respect and understanding. He never forced her to act, never dictated how she should live, but he offered guidance, wisdom, and unwavering support. And she, in turn, grew stronger, more confident, and more willing to embrace the life she had once feared could never be hers. Their connection was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet, steady, and enduring, a testament to the power of human kindness and recognition. By the end of Part 4, the girl had fully stepped into her new identity. She no longer saw herself as the town's joke or the saloon girl who begged for water. She was someone with purpose, dignity, and the courage to stand tall despite the judgments of others. The cradle, once a simple wooden object, had become a symbol of her transformation. Her name, carefully chosen and given with care, had unlocked a strength within her that no hardship could take away. And the cowboy, quiet and patient, had shown her that life could offer compassion, recognition, and the possibility of a future filled with hope. She had been given more than a name. She had been given a chance to see herself clearly, to embrace her own worth, and to step into a life that promised more than survival. It promised meaning, dignity, and the quiet joy of being truly seen. And as the sun set over the dusty town, casting long shadows and bathing the streets in warm light, the girl stood by the cradle, her heart filled with hope, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she was no longer alone. The days that followed were filled with quiet, steady changes. The girl, now carrying the name the cowboy had given her, moved through the town with a sense of purpose that had been completely foreign to her before. No longer just the saloon girl begging for water. She had begun to walk with confidence, her steps measured, her shoulders straight, and her gaze steady. People who had once laughed at her or ignored her began to notice. Some looked on with curiosity, others with skepticism, but even they could not deny the visible difference in the young woman who had once been overlooked. She had learned to embrace small moments of strength and joy. She woke each day with a quiet determination to live differently, to carry herself with dignity, and to respond to the world not with fear or anger, but with kindness and self-respect. The cradle, which had once been a simple wooden object, now symbolized her journey. It reminded her of the moment when the cowboy had believed in her, when he had shown her that she deserved care, respect, and a future unshaped by ridicule. Each morning she would arrange the blankets neatly, smoothing out wrinkles as though she were caring for not just the cradle, but the life she was building for herself. The cowboy continued to be a presence in her life, though he never imposed or demanded. He offered guidance when needed, sometimes speaking gently about patience, courage, and resilience, and other times simply sitting beside her in quiet companionship. His presence was a constant reminder that she was worthy of care and respect, and she drew strength from it. Over time, she began to feel a sense of independence as well. She learned that kindness could be offered, received, and also shared. She began to interact with townspeople differently, speaking clearly, helping quietly, and showing a warmth that could not be ignored. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty streets, the girl walked into the saloon, not as the timid, thirsty girl she had once been, but as someone who carried herself with quiet authority. She asked politely for a cup of water and a small meal, and though some of the regulars watched her with surprise, no one laughed. For the first time, she felt the power of being seen as a person, rather than a figure of amusement. She took her meal with grace, nodded to those around her, and stepped back into the sunlight with a sense of pride she had never known. The cradle remained a central part of her life. It had become more than a symbol. It was a daily reminder that small acts of care could transform lives. She polished it regularly, keeping it neat, and sometimes she would place small flowers beside it, imagining a brighter, gentler world where life could be nurtured rather than ridiculed. Townspeople, noticing her dedication, began to treat her differently. Some were inspired, some still whispered, but gradually respect began to replace mockery. And the girl, strengthened by her experiences and by the cowboy's quiet guidance, learned to stand firm in the face of both praise and doubt. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the cowboy came to see her. He smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, and asked how she felt. The girl paused, thinking of all that had happened, the laughter, the mockery, the small acts of care, and the transformation that had begun with a simple gesture of recognition. She felt a profound sense of gratitude and hope. "I feel strong," she said softly, her voice steady. I feel like I can face the world and still hold myself with dignity. I feel like I am no longer just surviving. I am living." The cowboy nodded, pleased, but said nothing more. He understood that words were not always needed. The change she carried was evident in every movement, every glance, and every act of quiet courage. She had begun to create her own life, shaped not by ridicule or hardship, but by care, recognition, and the belief in her own worth. As time passed, the girl began to engage more with the town. She helped others quietly, offering assistance where it was needed and speaking words of encouragement when people were struggling. She became known not for her past hardships, but for her strength, her kindness, and her willingness to see the good in others. The townspeople who had once mocked her gradually began to respect her, some even seeking her advice or help. She realized that respect was not about being loud or forceful, but about standing firm in one's integrity and carrying oneself with quiet confidence. The cradle, once the centerpiece of her small world, had become a symbol for others as well. Children would sometimes stop and watch her care for it, learning lessons of patience, kindness, and responsibility. Adults, too, took notice of the care she offered and the dignity she carried. The simple object that had been given to her had grown into a symbol of transformation, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward and touch many lives. Through it all, the cowboy remained a steady, reassuring presence. He did not interfere or take control of her life. Instead, he allowed her to grow at her own pace, offering guidance only when needed. He had shown her the power of recognition, the importance of hope, and the possibility of transformation, and now he witnessed the results of his quiet, persistent care. The girl had grown into her new identity fully, embracing her name, her dignity, and the strength that had always been inside her. One day, the girl stood beside the cradle looking at it with a sense of wonder. She realized how far she had come. From the dusty street outside the saloon, begging for water, to this moment of quiet empowerment. She had been laughed at, ignored, and judged, but through patience, care, and recognition, she had transformed her life. The cradle had been the beginning, the cowboy the guide, and her own determination the engine that had carried her forward. She felt a sense of peace she had never known, a quiet certainty that she could face any challenge with dignity and courage. The town had also changed, though, more subtly. People began to speak more kindly, offering help where it was needed, and children learned lessons of compassion simply by observing her. The girl's transformation inspired others to act with more care, to see the value in lives they had previously overlooked. In this small town, a ripple of kindness had begun, sparked by the simple acts of one cowboy and the resilience of a young girl who had been laughed at but refused to be broken. As the sun set each evening, casting the streets in warm golden light, the girl often found herself standing beside the cradle, reflecting on her journey. She remembered the cold, harsh mornings when she had begged for water, the laughter of the townspeople, and the despair she had felt. And yet, she also remembered the first time the cowboy had offered her water without judgment, the moment he had brought the cradle, and the day he had given her a name. Those moments had changed everything. They had shown her that life could hold more than hardship, that dignity and care were possible, and that even one person's kindness could alter the course of a life. By now, the girl had embraced her new life fully. She no longer relied on anyone else's approval, no longer waited for recognition from the townspeople. She had learned that self-respect, dignity, and kindness were far more powerful than mockery or fear. She moved through her days with quiet confidence, embracing her identity, nurturing the cradle, and living in a way that honored the lessons she had learned. The cowboy continued to visit, his presence a comforting reminder of the journey she had undertaken, but she no longer needed him to define her. She was fully capable of standing on her own, empowered by the care and recognition that had been given to her and the strength she had discovered within herself. In the evenings, as the town settled into quiet, she would sometimes see children or townspeople pausing to watch her care for the cradle or to notice the calm strength she carried. Some smiled, some whispered, but all witnessed a transformation that spoke louder than words. She had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and dignity, showing that even in a world that can be cruel and mocking, change is possible, and kindness can ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict. The girl, once laughed at and ignored, now walked the streets with her head held high, her steps confident, and her heart full. She had learned the value of hope, the power of recognition, and the importance of embracing one's identity. The cradle remained a symbol of the beginning, a reminder of the journey she had taken, and of the small acts of kindness that had changed her life forever. The cowboy, quiet and steady, had given her more than water, a cradle, or a name. He had given her the tools to reclaim her life, to step into her dignity, and to discover the power of self-respect. And so, the story ends not with a dramatic confrontation or a grand triumph, but with a quiet, steady sense of fulfillment. The girl, now fully herself, had faced hardship, ridicule, and loneliness, yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and filled with hope. She had been laughed at, mocked, and underestimated, but she had discovered the power of being seen, of being cared for, and of caring for herself. The town, once indifferent or mocking, now bore witness to her strength and dignity. And in that quiet recognition, she found the peace and empowerment that she had longed for all her life. She had survived. She had grown. And she had learned that the simplest acts of kindness, the belief of just one person, and the courage to embrace herself could transform a life entirely. She stood by the cradle, her heart full, and smiled at the future, a future she would shape with her own hands, one day at a time, filled with hope, dignity, and the quiet joy of being fully, wholly herself.